Good morning and welcome to the Point. The lame duck legislative session is over and lawmakers have left Lansing. The outcome, in addition to dozens of lesser bills that received little attention, is a plan to put a number of constitutional changes on the ballot in May to let you decide. The $2.5 billion tax increase would be offset with $750 million of tax reductions. That's accomplished by putting a wholesale tax on at the pump and taking the sales tax off, increasing the sales tax on everything else you buy to 7%, and spending most of the excess on tax credits for low-income earners, schools, and other priorities that we're told were needed to get a deal between Republicans and Democrats, the House and the Senate and the governor. Many at the Capitol lamented that legislators did not at very least create an either-or scenario, giving voters the opportunity to choose to replace a gas tax with a sales tax or keep the tax at the pump, guaranteeing at least some funding. As it is now, if the ballot initiative fails, there's no new money for roads, which means our next guest may have to tackle the problem when she joins the legislature next month. Cindy Gamrat, a Republican from Plainwell, will serve in the 80th district representing Allegan County starting in January. We talked with her before we knew what would happen in the just finished session. I'll start by congratulating you after your election to the State House. Now you're elected, you go into a pretty big Republican majority. Tell me what it's like. Let's start with the leadership election that you were involved in. What it's like now being a part of this process, even though you haven't been officially sworn in.
Amazing and humbling. I'll just tell you, just overwhelming. All of those things, very different from the campaign. Now it's like a whole different world, and so glad to be done with that campaign part of it. But we had orientation last week, and we also did the speaker's vote that you mentioned, and there was nothing like just walking onto the House floor. Incredibly humbling experience of, what this really is all about, and that servant leadership, and it's just, I can't even explain it and describe it to you, and it just really caught me pretty hard.
Tell me a little bit about that leadership vote, because there is and has been for some time a struggle within the Republican Party for the more conservative wing of the party and people who are considered more moderate and the views that they share. I know you can't discuss what happens in caucus, but in general, what is your take about the direction where the Republican majority is going, given the election just passed?
Right. And I would say you said conservative and moderate. I believe in the Republican platform of the party, and that's why I ran for it. So I don't know if you call that conservative or moderate, but I hold to the values of the Republican platform. When I look at the caucus and the people that were elected, I've heard that we are some of the most conservatives, one of the most conservative freshman class that's been elected in 25 years. Now the feeling and atmosphere there, I can share, I think, is that one of camaraderie. It was a really great experience in caucus. I was pleasantly surprised just at really the fellowship that happened, the mutual respect that everybody was treated with. So I really look forward to working with everybody there, regardless of the views that they hold or the positions. In orientation, I had an opportunity to, it was with the Democrats and Republicans, and so I really enjoyed meeting many of the Democrats as well. And so I think it's going to be, I really look forward to this term. I think it's going to be a great term with a group of people who really want to work together to solve some of the issues of Michigan. I think there's going to be some heated debates, but I think in the end, we're all going to come together, I hope, to really help Michigan move forward in a better direction.
What are some of those things you want to work towards? What is it that you would like to get started on right away?
I am really interested in seeing oversight and the plan of things and doing things well with the taxpayer dollars. And so, for instance, going up to all these years, I think the taxpayers have expected that the taxes and they, many of them think the money at the gas pump is going to roads, and that. So where has that been? Why aren't they fixed? And so that oversight component is very, very important to me. So I would look heavily on that part of it. But I think there's a lot of other things that will come up on the other side after lame duck session in the next term that I hope to be able to impact it. I think what I sense and what I'd like to bring to the table is, how do we make Michigan more competitive? I ran on making Michigan more business friendly for my children and grandchildren, and so we can be more competitive. And so I think there's a lot of things that will be looked at as far as taxes go, continuing to peel back regulations. how do we make Michigan more competitive? And so I think that is kind of a broad term, but I do think it's gonna focus a little bit on tax strategy. At least I hope so.
When you talk about taxes, one of the big complaints from Democrats during this past election cycle was that Governor Snyder had done a fair amount of tax relief, but they said it had all gone to big business, and that he had also raised taxes, and those taxes, again, they said, had all fallen on middle class people. When you talk about taxes, what kind of tax relief are you talking about?
Yeah, I would take a more approach that is underlying helps everybody, like decreasing income tax in general for everybody, or decreasing the sales tax, or going to a fair tax, or I am not as much for segmenting out certain populations and giving favors to one or the other. So I'm more interested in creating an environment that benefits everybody.
It is a $50+ billion budget, and most of that is federal pass-through money, and I don't expect you to know everything that's in the budget within 30 days after you've been elected, but it stands to reason that if you want to do things like, perhaps, and you're not saying this is what you will do, but if you wanted to cut the sales tax, or if you wanted to cut the income tax, it would seem to stand to reason you'd have to make corresponding cuts in spending as well. Are there areas that you have already identified that you think you could reduce spending?
There are a few, and I think that it's both of those, both sides of the budget that definitely have to get looked at when you're talking about it. You can't just do one side without the other. Right off the top of my head comes the MEDC. I think that's a $300 or $400 million program that really hasn't shown to me, I think, to be beneficial as it says it has. But also, it's a form of a corporate handout and welfare. So that's one that I would strive to eliminate right away. And there have been a lot of programs that have been instituted by our state government that are not found in the state constitution. And so in our earlier interview, I talked about how I would do the budget is how I do it at home, having to prioritize what are the things that are necessities and that we're held responsible for in our state constitution, roads and infrastructure being one of them, education. So that's where I would go back to that. I would actually like to see, and what I hope happens, and I hope the new Speaker of the House encourages, is that the budgets are unrolled. And right now it's this omnibus budget that's passed an up or down vote. It's all together. I would like to see those enrolled somewhat, and maybe even look at zero-based budgeting for the budget decisions moving forward. So I hope we have some conversation on that.
Do you have any anticipation that, given leadership and the makeup of the majority in which you serve, that those are the kind of conversations you will have? Do you think that there is a desire to break from what has been the habit over the past 4 years, and by the way, break from what the governor has suggested within the ranks of the Republican majority that will take over in January?
The conversation has already even been there regarding those issues. So the conversation is already there, and it's starting, at least amongst the members that I've spoken to. I think the question seems to come down is then you have the governor and his input, and then you have the Senate Majority Leader and his input, and you have the Speaker that get together once a week. And so, and that's one of the reasons that we, Gary Glenn, Todd Corser, and I have pushed for the Hastert rule, is because I think it's important that those conversations that are happening, that voice of the caucus, gets heard by the Speaker when he goes into those meetings with the governor. And so you have these opposing, if you want to call it that, agendas. You know, the governor will have his agenda, the Speaker will have his agenda, and so I think it remains to be seen yet how that's going to mesh together, how that's going to work together, or who's going to come out on top.
For people who don't know, talk about the Hastert rule for just a minute. Name for former Illinois Congressman, Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert, a Republican. What is it? What is your perception of the Hastert rule?
For me, the reason why I support the Hastert rule is just what I said. I am kind of that grassroots kind of person, and I believe that voice of the people is very important. I believe it helps to carry that voice so that there's more than one person making the decision in the end than the one person who is the Speaker. And so the Hastert rule, what it would do, it would say the Speaker needs to listen to the majority of the caucus, or at least, you know, abide by that in taking things up and pushing forward an agenda. And so that's why I support the Hastert rule. I think it's a little bit more of a grassroots approach and more captures the voice of the people.
The Hastert rule, as it was used at the federal level, was to say that you would not pass legislation without a majority of the majority. In other words, you wouldn't take a small percentage of the majority and a large percentage of the minority to pass bills. You mentioned one of your colleagues in Representative-elect Garcia, who has, if I understand it, and I may have read this wrong, but in his release seemed to be calling for maybe even the ouster of the current Speaker of the House because of some of the legislations in lame duck. Is that a little overstating it? I mean, at this early stage as a representative-elect before everybody gets in place, or is that the kind of thing that we're going to see going forward?
You know, I think we all have our own approaches, and I certainly believe in freedom of speech. And this issue in particular, I think it was the Elliott Larson expansion issue that you're talking about. I'll actually have a press release coming out in a little bit on that issue myself, because I believe it's an important issue that I ran on, that my constituents elected me to be a strong voice in regards to carrying their values forward on that. And so I promised them I would, and that's what they elected me for. And so that particular issue, we have seen it played out around the country, the difficulties that come when you provide special class protection to one group over another. And my belief is that religious freedom is in peril because of that. So I feel strongly about that issue. Apparently he feels strongly about that issue as well. And I think, and of course it's coming up, it's up in lame duck right now. And so I know I'm concerned about it. I've talked to many other representatives who share the same concerns. So.
When we come back, another new face representing the West Coast in Lansing. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. In Holland, Daniela Garcia will be representing the 90th District as a newly elected lawmaker. We talked with her before the lame duck session about what she wants to achieve in the coming year. To start with, congratulations. You had a pretty hectic primary. The general election in your district is usually a lot more tame, which was
Correct.
the case again this cycle. But now that you're officially elected, as you get ready to go in January and go to Lansing, what is the first thing you want to concentrate on?
Yeah, well, first I'd just like to say to the folks in my district in West Michigan that I'm truly humbled and honored to be in the position that I am going to the state legislature. I think the first thing that is on all of our minds is the economy and continuing the growth and the forward progression that we have been making as a state and making sure that we're continuing to work on that.
The economy is an interesting question because as a Republican, very often I hear people in your party say, well, look, the economy isn't about the government. It's not about jobs that can be created by the government.
Right.
But it's about what government can do, very often, your colleagues would say, to get the government out of the way. So what do you want the state to do to help work on an economy that still is far from being completely healthy?
Sure. I mean, I think we have government is responsible for helping to create the environment by which job creators and businesses then can grow in their communities and be innovative in their communities. You know, we have already reduced a number of regulations, I believe in the thousands, and that is one step forward in making sure that business can go on as usual and that we can recruit business and talent to our state. Additionally, I believe there are some additional tax code items that we can address to make sure that we are continuing on our path of success.
You just you hit one of the hot button issues from this past election cycle when you said taxes, because you saw the television ads that were on every break that talked about all the taxes that had been raised during the Snyder administration. And let's be clear, you weren't there for any of those.
Correct.
Because this is your very first term, which is why you're on this program, because we're talking with all new legislators. But talk to me about taxes from that perspective. Obviously, business got a revamp of the Michigan business tax, which was previously the single business tax. So that revamp happened, but the governor's Democratic challenger was very strident about saying, look, you raised taxes on middle class folks in a number of different ways. When you talk about taxes, you were talking about burdensome taxes
Correct.
to business
Correct.
as you would describe them. What about taxes on the folks out there that are trying to maintain and pay their mortgage and do that kind of thing?
I think we need to be very mindful. That conversation I heard at many doors as I was knocking this summer, making sure that we have a fair tax system, and I think that's where we started having debate about the pension tax that occurred last year. But making sure that those individuals who are on fixed incomes, my parents are retired, my grandparents are retired, still have opportunity and can live successfully and vibrantly here in the state of Michigan. One of the things, we obviously eliminated the personal property tax for businesses through a proposal, and making sure that that implementation is taking effect appropriately and properly and doing what we said that it would do. So that's something that I'm sure all of us will be monitoring as we move forward. But obviously, we are all concerned about the individuals in our communities and how they are living in our communities. So whatever we do, we'll be mindful of that.
You bring up two interesting points. First, let's talk about the pension tax, because it was suggested to me, and I should say not by a Republican, but it was suggested to me that there were Republicans who were running for state house and state senate who were saying, at least quietly, that they had questions about the pension tax. Is that something that gets reviewed, or is it here to stay?
I think we're past that conversation. I think maybe those of us who are newer to the conversation will do a little bit more research to ask the questions of the individuals in our communities. How is this impacting you today? Maybe a check-in in 6 months to make sure that it is a fair system and that it isn't hurting individuals too terribly.
Personal property tax is the other thing you brought up, and that may have been one of the most convoluted initiatives that we have seen for a long time, because the vast majority of people who were asked to go to the polls and vote on that had no real concept, because unless you were a business owner, you didn't really understand what it meant. And briefly, just as a refresher for folks, it meant that in the state of Michigan, if you bought a piece of equipment, for example, you ended up paying taxes on that each year that you owned that piece of equipment, versus paying just a sales tax when you first bought it. Those people who opposed that personal property tax said it was unfair. They launched a really big initiative to get it passed that involved bringing together union and management, and bringing together firefighters, police officers, and school administrators, and conservatives and liberals, and this big coalition, and so it passed. But now you say you want to make sure it's implemented, because that money was going to places like schools and public safety and those kind of things. So there is a concern that still lingers for some people that funding remains at the right level.
Yeah, undoubtedly it's going to help our businesses and making sure that they can go, on business as usual. But just making sure that our local governments, units of government, are funded appropriately, and it is very important to all of us. It was a very convoluted proposal, and I know that I spent some time trying to educate folks, as we all did, on the issue. That proposal language is always pretty difficult, but was pretty successful because there was such broad support, which we, I think, sometimes rarely see on some of these issues. But there is some concern, and we'll just continue to monitor to make sure that our local units of government are funded as they should be.
I want to ask you a question that doesn't have to do directly with policy, not specific policy, but the outcome of policy, and that is this. If businesses in the state of Michigan got a pretty broad-based tax break under this governor, as is the common perception, and if after that rather broad-based tax break, there was another tax break on personal property for those businesses, when do you start measuring the result? Unemployment has dropped, but it's dropped all over the country, and they haven't made those changes. So how do you measure, as a brand new freshman legislator, you look back and say, okay, Mr. Businessman, Miss Businesswoman, you've gotten these tax breaks. Show me the job, show me the prosperity, show me the benefit to the state. How do you measure that?
I think it's on all of us who have been represented to continue to have conversations with our stakeholders in our communities across the state. I'm a data-driven person myself and like to see the data. With business, I think you can see some of the impact a little bit faster than you can either in government or perhaps even in school education type data. So I think we need to consistently just have those conversations with folks at home and make sure that it is having the impact that we intended it to have. And if it isn't, then we need to have those conversations as well.
Talk to me a little bit about education in schools, because one of the themes that I have heard from folks as they have come through and talked with us is that school funding, which is always a question, but it's not just about the amount, it is the mechanism for school funding. Given again that you are just taking office, have you given any thought to or had any conversations with folks about the way school, not again the amount, but the way schools are funded?
Yeah, I mean, Proposal A, I think, has had a pretty big impact on the way schools are funded, obviously, over the last 20 years in the state of Michigan. It has been 20 years, though, since we reviewed how schools are funded, and it may be the time that we have conversation about whether that's appropriate to move forward or we start having different conversations. One of the things that is important to me is education, making sure that there's quality and accessible education for all students. So I've already started having conversations with my superintendents in my district, even in the Grand Rapids area as well, because I see all of us as a region here in West Michigan. So we'll continue to have conversations about how schools are funded. As you said, there's always controversy in how the actual funding goes about, but I want to make sure that those conversations are fruitful and impactful, and that are inclusive of all of the stakeholders, including businesses and families, as well as the educators, are at the table when we have that conversation. In that same conversation is the inevitable question about the cost of higher education, because in Michigan, as it is around the country, higher education has become prohibitive in terms of cost, but a necessity in terms of success, it would seem. The governor has come up with some plans who said that skilled vocational training is also very important. But when you think about that 4-year degree, or at least the minimum 4-year degree, what role can the legislature play with these relatively autonomous groups, which are state universities? What role can the legislature play to try to curb those costs? Sure. I think the legislature has already tried, in that they've invested some additional funding into higher education, while of course asking for some information and some accountability back from institutions of higher education. It should be noted, though, that funding for higher education, in the state of Michigan has decreased over the last 20 years, and I would dare say that it's probably 10 or 12% of state funding actually goes to our state institutions. There is definitely a role. Again, we need to, it's not just a higher education problem, but it's also a K-12 issue. As you talked, is there room for vocational training? Is there room for programs with community colleges and credits, and working with institutions of higher education, traditional 4-year institutions? So I think we can at least start the conversation, continue some investment, ask for accountability, but make sure that it is accessible for all of our students here in the state of Michigan. As you prepare to take this next step into this legislative body, you find yourself going in with very healthy majority, going into this caucus, but you also find yourself with this. Republicans have been for the past 4 and will for at least the next 2 be in charge of everything in sight in the state of Michigan. Right. How much pressure is on not just you individually, but on your party in control of the governor's office and the Senate by a wide majority in the House to get it right? Because at the end of the day, it pretty much comes down to your 56 votes and those 19 over in the Senate and the governor. If you get Democrats, that's one thing, but you can do most of this with your own votes. Right. I think we're all mindful of the out years, whether that's 2016 when we have a presidential election, or even in 2020, making sure that we're thinking about our communities and our base, so to speak. It's always mindful. I think we're always aware that making sure that we are coming up with thoughtful solutions to problems in the state of Michigan is very important to all of us in making sure that we're addressing the problems. I mean, it's not just politics, it's policy that is important. And so, it is, all of us are going to work towards that, Republicans and Democrats.
More to the point in just a moment. So the lame duck session is over, the holidays are upon us, and with a little luck, this will be a quiet political news cycle. But we have a lot more new representatives to introduce to you, and we'll have 2 more when you join us next week. To the point.